Okay, let's go. Number 7, Antarctica, the icy, unclaimed wasteland at the bottom of the world. During the medieval period, it had 0 towns, 0 kingdoms, and 0 people, unless you count the occasional hallucinating sailor who thought he saw land just before freezing to death. Technically, you couldn't die here during the Middle Ages because no one was here to begin with. No battles, no plagues, no public executions, just an endless expanse of ice, penguins, and bad decisions, which in a way might actually make this the safest place on Earth at the time, unless you were there, which is a weird concept. Now let's just say you were there. Imagine you just teleported or spawned there. First, your fingers would go numb, then your face. You think you're sweating, you feel like you're burning, but that's just the hypothermia kicking in. Your thoughts get fuzzy and hallucinations start kicking in. You start to think the ice is talking to you. You collapse face first into the snow, and the last thing you hear is the sound of absolutely nothing. The worst part, your body won't ever decompose. It's just been added to the landscape. Number 6. Welcome to medieval Asia, where dying wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance. And no death sums that up better than Ling Chi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for the worst criminals, traitors, murderers, and people who forgot to bow low enough. This punishment was exactly what it sounds like. You'd be tied to a wooden frame, stripped down and then sliced, slowly, carefully, strategically. First, the limbs, then the chest, then the face. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, they'd keep you alive on purpose for as long as possible because apparently dying too quickly would be disrespectful to the process. And the best part, it was all public. People would gather to watch you fall apart like a human piñata. The executioner had to be precise too. Too fast and he got punished. Too slow and the crowd got bored. A real lose-lose situation for everyone. Picture yourself there. Somehow you managed to avoid Ling Chi. Maybe you kept your mouth shut. Maybe you weren't important enough to be tortured artistically. Congrats. You now get to die like everyone else. Horribly. For the average person in medieval Asia, death came from something far more boring. Famine, disease, war. Entire villages would starve to death during droughts. A disease could wipe out your entire town. And if you were lucky enough to survive all that, congratulations, you just made it to adulthood, where you could now die in childbirth, be slaughtered by a winning army, or again, not be able to source food. Number 5. Now we go back to North America, before the skyscrapers and the fast food, and way before colonization. Back then, this land was ruled by complex indigenous civilization, roaming nomads, and a ruthless and unforgiving wilderness. There were no Iron Maidens, no dungeons, and no gallows, just Mother Nature. If you lived in the North, winter could kill you faster than anything. A large blizzard, and you'd vanish under 10 feet of snow, never to be seen again. In the Southwest, dehydration was a daily threat, along with stampedes, wildfires, snake bites, starvation, take your pick. Not to mention bears, wolves, and other predators roamed the land. If you were one of the lucky ones, and you weren't eaten by a bear or frozen solid in a blizzard, how would you die? Probably violently. Because while many indigenous cultures lived in relative balance, conflict was still common. Territorial wars, raids, ritual battles. If you were captured, you might be sacrificed to appease the gods, or worse, used in a public torture ritual designed to honor your bravery by making your death last as long as humanly possible. Picture being tied to a pole while your enemies slowly peel your skin, burn your limbs, and dare you to scream. You don't. That's the rule. You must not scream. And when you finally die, they consider it a sign of honor. And as always, you could die from one of many painful and gruesome diseases, which in North America was even more likely than in one of the more built-up continents with more advanced medical research, tools, and medicine. Number 4, medieval South America. Medieval South America was ruled by empires that were insanely advanced, and also insanely into human sacrifice. The Inca, the Moche, and most famously, the Aztecs. Their architecture was brilliant. Their astronomy, revolutionary. Their preferred way of saying thanks to the gods, ripping out your still beating heart and showing it to you before you died. If the harvest was bad, someone had to die. If the harvest was good, still had to die. If the sun rose in the morning, definitely someone's heart getting carved out for that. It wasn't personal, it was just business. Picture yourself there. Imagine you're one of the unlucky ones that looks particularly symmetrical, or just unfortunate enough to be captured in a neighboring raid. First, they'd paint you up, maybe dress you in feathers. You looked great. Then they'd parade you through the streets before you'd be laid on a stone altar, arms and legs pinned, while a priest with a razor-sharp obsidian blade stood over you. He doesn't hesitate. That blade slices into your chest like butter, cracks open your ribs. In one fluid motion, Your heart is yanked out and held high, dripping, steaming, offered to the heavens. If you were really lucky, they'd throw your body down the temple steps for extra drama. Maybe you escaped all that. Maybe you weren't part of a major empire. Maybe you lived deep in the jungle, far from the stone altars and screaming crowds. Great! Now you get to die from infected wounds, tropical diseases, or you could even get eaten by a jaguar. Number 3, medieval Africa. Medieval Africa was a massive, diverse continent full of kingdoms, empires, tribes, and city-states, all with their own customs, rulers, and extremely creative ways to die. You had the Mali Empire flourishing in the west, the Ethiopian highlands ruled by Christian kings, and nomadic tribes roaming the Sahara. So yeah, death here came in many forms, and none of them were subtle. In some regions, death was very practical: poisoned arrows, impalement, or just getting trampled in a cattle raid. In others, it was spiritual. You didn't just die, your soul was judged, recycled, or feared. Witchcraft accusations were no joke. All it took was a strange look, a bad crop, or a kid getting sick, and suddenly you were being beaten to death by the entire village. If you weren't deemed magical, didn't offend the wrong spirits, or end up in a tribal feud, congrats, you made it, sort of. But here's the reality. Most people died from the stuff no one writes songs about. You might get bit by a tsetse fly and slowly waste away from sleeping. Maybe you cut your foot walking barefoot and the infection spreads up your leg, turning it into a rotting tree trunk. Or maybe, just maybe, you get malaria so many times that your body simply quits. And if you were part of a royal court, don't relax, because if the king dies, guess who might be buried with him to serve in the afterlife? You, even if you're not dead yet. Number 2, medieval Australia. In the medieval era, Australia was home to hundreds of thriving Aboriginal nations, each with their own languages, spiritual systems, and survival tactics. This wasn't the Australia of beaches and barbecues. It was the Australia where everything could kill you, and most of it had legs, fangs, or venom. There were no kingdoms, no castles, and definitely no jails. If you committed a serious offense, punishment came from your own people, through exile, spearings, or, if things got really bad, a traditional payback ceremony. And payback wasn't some fine, it was justice, carried out with violence. Sometimes it was a spear through the thigh, sometimes through the chest. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were sacred, ritualized. And what kept the laws upheld? You're one of the lucky ones and you didn't get exiled, speared, or eaten by a snake. Congratulations. You'd still have to survive heat stroke, water shortages, venomous spiders, crocodiles, and bushfires. And that's before we get to the real killer: thirst. Because in Australia, the most likely cause of death wasn't a wild animal or a war. It was the land itself. It was walking too far from your group without enough water. It was misreading the sky or forgetting the signs of a dried-out riverbed. It was the sun baking your skull until you collapsed, alone and disoriented, surrounded by nothing but red dust and the sound of cicadas. And finally, number 1, medieval Europe was the blueprint for organized chaos. If you weren't dying in a war, you were dying from famine. If you survived famine, you'd get the plague. Imagine you got accused of witchcraft, despite not actually doing anything, so the local torturer had to perform rat torture on you, trying to get you to confess. He tied you down, and a metal cage containing a starved rat was placed on your bare abdomen. The torturer then heated the cage with hot coals, forcing the rat to dig its way out, through your flesh. In its panic to escape the heat, the animal would claw, bite, and burrow through your skin, muscle, and organ, often keeping you alive for hours, as you were literally eaten alive from the inside. But not everyone endured this. Most people died to a range of different things. Let's start with the obvious: the Black Death, mid-1300s. 1/3 of the population is gone. People dropped dead in the street. Families locked themselves in their homes and still got sick. Doctors wore beak masks stuffed with herbs and had zero clue what they were doing. Your odds of survival? Not great. Your odds of dying in agony surrounded by terrified peasants? Pretty high. Then there were the wars. Endless, stupid wars. The 100 Years' War, Viking raids, civil wars, border skirmishes over land no one actually wanted. You could die on the battlefield, sure, but just as likely from gangrene in a muddy ditch because your open wound hadn't seen soap in weeks. Oh, and don't forget religious death. They had an entire menu of execution methods: hanging, beheading, quartering, drawing, stoning, and the crowd favorite, burning at the stake, preferably in a town square. Now let's just say you were there, and you were lucky. You weren't poor, diseased, or accused of being friends with Satan. You weren't at war. You weren't starving. Then you must be the king.